Hola, it's Joe Pardavila, and you're listening to the Forbes Books Podcast. It's now 2023, and we've come a long way as a society, but we still have so much more to learn when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It can be incredibly complex, but it doesn't have to be complicated. This week on the pod, I'm joined by my old friend, Dr. Nika White. For over 20 years, she's helped companies across the globe create more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable cultures. And on January 31st, she is dropping her third book, Inclusion Uncomplicated, a transformative guide to simplify DEI. In it, she provides the tools to help folks become allies, change makers, and inclusive leaders, no matter where they are on the DEI journey. Dr. Nika, how are you?
I am doing very well, Joe. How are you?
I'm excellent. So it's been about a year since we last spoke. Let's start on a positive if we can. We had a really wide-ranging discussion about DEI. What's it been like the last year? What have you seen? What are the positives that's coming out in that space that you've seen since the last time we spoke in February 2022?
Yeah, Joe, it has been a full year and a lot has changed in a year. I think one of the biggest things that I have noticed is that people are starting to dig deeper. They are trying to go, just below the surface. I think that after George Floyd's murder, we saw a lot of organizational leaders to begin to realize they no longer could sit on the sidelines. They had to become much more intentional about deepening their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they were uncertain about what that looks like. Now that we are, 2 years past that time frame, people have started to really test the waters. And as they test the waters, there's this appetite to go deeper, to make sure that organizations are really driving towards sustainable impact, which is exciting. I also believe that we have an equal number of organizations that are engaging in some missteps,
Mm-hmm.
and those missteps are really, I think they're well intended, but it's showing up as performative to a lot of people, particularly those that are part of marginalized communities. And that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to write this book. I wanted to help organizational leaders at the individual accountability level, as well as the organizational level, to think more intently about this work of uncomplicating inclusion and really making it practical so that the work can be sustained. So that's what I'm noticing.
Cool. And on your first point about going deeper, in December, you published an article on LinkedIn titled Managing a Black Woman, Here's How to Become Her Success Partner and Ally. By the way, if folks who do not follow you on LinkedIn, make sure you give Dr. Nika a follow. She's fantastic on there. But talk to me about that article, because I think that's where now we're at this point in our DEI journey where, okay, big picture, we've all got the 30,000-foot view about making sure we've got diversity and equality and inclusion, but now we got to get into the nitty-gritty. So why was it important for you to write this article about managing Black women?
Yeah, well, what's interesting about that article is that I wrote it and it originally appeared in Entrepreneur. And it was after Minda Harts, a dear friend that's also a very astute DEI leader in this space. And she does a lot of work around women of color, helping to advance women of color and take their rightful place into different organizations and society in general. She was releasing her book entitled Right Within. And I brought her on to one of my podcasts, Intentional Conversations podcast. And she talked a lot about the importance of success partners, which is another way in which she talks about allies, specifically for women of color and even more specifically for Black women. Because as we think about the different populations that are often most disenfranchised, Black women certainly are at the top of that list. And so it has a lot to do with just recognizing that no one group is a monolith, but there certainly are signs of evidence where we're seeing a lot of organizations not fully leaning into these innovative approaches to how can we create greater parity and to change the narrative around Black women being so oppressed and having lack of opportunity. And so I really wanted to amplify some of her thoughts, which as a Black woman, a Black founder, I felt really seen as I was talking with her, listening with her, and reading her book. And I think that part of some of the elements that is or has been included in my book, Inclusion Uncomplicated, certainly amplifies the mindset that people need to have as we're trying to engage in some really big solutions to some really big problems.
Hmm. And not speaking for all white leaders, but I think this is where I guess some discomfort comes up because I think they all want to be equal to everyone, but then they're like, "Ooh, can I say black women and black men? Can I separate it?" And you were talking about the fact that it's not a monolith. How can people sort of break out of their comfort zones where they're not uncomfortable being the fact that yes, I'm dealing with a black woman here or I'm dealing with a white woman here? Do you see any of that uncomfort or discomfort from leadership?
It's a great question, Joe, and I think it has a lot to do with choosing courage over comfort. There are a lot of people, they will stray away from certain conversations because they don't know what to say and they feel like they have to walk on eggshells. But the reality is that being silent, being complicit is a message as well, and it doesn't serve us well, right? Especially as we are trying to drive towards an equitable society. And so, yes, no one group is a monolith, but I think that being willing to acknowledge the difference is a start. Some people will say, I don't see color, I don't see race. And I think that they're well intended. But the reality is that you are erasing me as a Black woman when you say that. And so we just have to get comfortable with having the conversation, asking the tough questions, doing our own investigative work to build up our knowledge base so that we can become much more in tuned to the lived experiences of others the best way that we can. And that requires us getting proximate to those problems, to those communities, collaborating with them, having conversations with them, understanding what does support look like for you. And right now, to your initial question of what prompted me to write that article, I realize that Black women right now are the most oppressed when it comes to the workplace, when it comes to society in general. And so that was, as a Black founder myself, was really important for me to amplify.
I love that. And it's funny because I think we might have talked this in past conversations, but I think people are so afraid to make a mistake. I think we're so
Yes,
afraid that like even me asking that question to you, I know I've known you long enough where I know you knew I was coming from a good place, but I
of
think
course.
some people would be like, can I if I'm a white guy, can I ask a black woman question? You know what I mean? I think it's like
Yeah.
we're so afraid. How can we stop being so afraid, Dr. Nika?
Well, I think we have to realize that there is a level of accountability we have individually. And so before we're going to try to seek out a Black woman, a Black man, anyone that's unlike us, right, to help educate us on their lived experiences, we have to ask ourselves, what homework have we done on our own, right? There are way too many resources that abound right now just around this broad topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so whether it's films or it's, papers, it's, webinars, conferences, books, there's so many different things, right? And so, we can't assume that the burden needs to be placed directly on the person who is, marginalized
Hmm.
to help educate others. And so I think that once people feel a bit more educated, it makes it easier to engage in conversations. And once the relationship has been established, through that relationship, we have enough rapport and hopefully enough emotional intelligence to be able to discern whether or not this is a relationship in the right time and place for me to engage this person around some deep curiosities that I could be holding. And I have to respect that if that person says, I'm not ready for that conversation right now, or directs me to another source, then let me honor that and respect that, right? But let me not assume that they need to relive some of the trauma that can be present when they're talking about some of those lived experiences that are really oppressive and traumatizing.
Mm. It's oh so complicated, Dr. Nika, but your book is titled Inclusion Uncomplicated. We've been talking for a few minutes here where, if someone's just popping in, it all sounds like a lot. Like it sounds
Yes.
complicated. So how does your book make it uncomplicated?
Yeah, well, I think this is the key to helping more people to become a part of solving for this big, daunting challenge of creating parity and inclusion and spaces that are equitable for all. We have to make sure we are unraveling the knot, is kind of how I like to say it, that binds humanity together. And what I mean by that is the complexity of diversity, equity, and inclusion is causing too many people to stay out of the conversation. And when people stay out of the conversation, then it lessens our ability and our collective potential to address systemic oppression. And so through this book, my goal is to deliver simple, actionable tools for real change, to make it practical. I think that if people can digest the work in a way that feels a bit less daunting, then there's greater chance for each of us to do our part instead of sitting on the sidelines or waiting for the experts, right? The person who carries the title of Chief Diversity Officer, Manager, Director, or even the HR professionals to do this work. Because, Joe, the reality is that this work belongs to all of us. And so there's a great level of wisdom that I believe is contained in the pages of this book that will help people to decipher how to navigate, these conversations, how to apply with great conviction some of the best practices, to act on ways in which they can leverage their influence and power and privilege to be able to help bind humanity in a way that serves us all best.
Wonderful. And I know the goal of the book is behavioral change. And I know we've had past conversations about that. In the wake of the George Floyd murder, there was everyone started checking the DEI box. You started seeing corporations promoting the fact that they were going to be doing more and more of this. You saw companies put Black Lives Matter on all of their buildings and websites. But at the end of the day, all of that is window dressing. It's the key is this behavioral change. So how do we get outside of the check the box, make sure everyone who applies for a job has equal opportunity to get the job, to now change these behaviors and just instead of just putting on a show?
It starts first with the right mindset, right? And so, chapter one of the book, it leads in with helping people to understand that inclusion is a mindset. Sometimes we like to box inclusion in and see it as just a checklist of things, and it's not that at all. I mean, certainly there's a lot of action behind it. There's a lot of strategic thought leadership behind it. There's a lot of calculated risk that I think sometimes people could be holding as they're engaging in this work. But if your mindset is one of which that allows you to believe that you can be a part of the solution and that you do have power, right? We all have some level of influence, whether we realize it or not. Then I think that positions us to best engage in this work in really meaningful ways. And so I think it starts there. I think it also starts with the personal accountability, right? When we think about organizations, and organizations certainly have a significant role in helping to serve as a model for how to do equity work well, right? But when we think about organizations, they are ran by people, right? So this work has to start at the personal level, that personal accountability, that personal learning journey, and then letting that learning allow for application. And so we talk a lot about even the power of story. Sometimes just understanding someone's lived experience, having people to express their lived experience with, the feel words, we can't help but to be connected, right? And to be drawn in. And I think that yields empathy and compassion. And that's what helps to center humanity. I think that one of the biggest things we forget about this work of equity and inclusion is that at the heart of it is humanity. And that's what I really do center on in this book. And then we also talk about, some very specific behavioral ways in which people can actualize this mindset. Like, how can we be an effective ally? What does that look like in practice? How can we make sure that we are taking inventory of our own sources of power and privilege and using it honorably to be able to help others to have success created for them? And so that's my hope. I want, Joe, at the end, for people to not just put this book back on the bookshelf once they've finished it, but to keep it on their desk, to keep it on their credenza, to keep it on their nightstand, and to ever so often to see it as a key resource they can go to when they're really trying to decipher, well, what's next? And what does this book say about this particular situation? I want the pages to be dog-eared. I want there to be a lot of highlights and writing in the margins. And so this really is a transformative guide that I believe is going to help people simplify DEI. And in that process, they're going to be better off in helping to really facilitate this work.
Hmm. And I love in chapter 2, you talk about the power of story, like you mentioned. And I always say everyone has a story. And when I speak to folks about this and getting people to share their story, they're always like, hey, listen, I'm not that kind of person. I'm not a type A. I'm not the extrovert. I have trouble sharing my story. What do you say to those folks? Because the best I can tell folks is if they have trouble telling their stories, just like listen to others and then find people you have a connection with. But how do you help people to tell their story to others when maybe they're not prepared or feel comfortable to share their story?
Yeah, well, we have to model first and foremost for those that do have the emotional capacity and they have the trust and the wherewithal to be vulnerable and share their story. What they're doing is they're giving others permission to do the same thing, right? And so I think sometimes we have to have those leaders who are willing to model. Secondly, I think it's about building relationships and creating spaces that feel safe so that people can show up bravely, right? If you feel that you're in a space to where people are assuming positive intent, to where people are interested in perspective sharing and taking, then it's easier for you to be open to sharing your story, right? So, one of the things I talk about in the book are how do you create these spaces? And part of solving for that are having these community agreements, right? That helps ground everyone that is centered around those conversations to be mindful of how to show up, right?
Mm.
How to show up, how to support, to lean into your vulnerabilities. And so I think that's those are two really critical things that I think can really help impact people's ability to feel brave about sharing their stories.
Hmm. I love the fact too that you talk about DEI as an opportunity, not an obligation. It's sort of like I have these conversations with folks in the clean energy space, Dr. Nika, where when they're trying to work on their clean energy projects, if they run into someone who's conservative or someone who's maybe not so that doesn't really have the same view on climate change. They say, forget about the fact that climate change. Here's what clean energy can do. Here's how much money you can make in clean energy. And in a way, I feel like that's how you can almost handle the DEI conversation, where it's like, if listen, if you don't know the history of it or understand the history of it, fine. But look at what it could do for a company. Just at the end of the day, the positive impacts that it can have. And I feel like that's sort of like the tack you take with this book as well.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely one approach, but it's not the approach. And what I mean by that, Joe, is when I talk about DEI being an opportunity and not an obligation, I really want to put it in context of the totality of the value proposition. And follow me here because there's a reason that this is significant. We have spent a lot of time really uncovering the importance of the business case of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I use the word importance because I truly believe that there is significance to amplifying the business case, right, to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But more importantly, I think there's a case to help people to feel confident just in understanding the humanity aspect of it. And I think that part of that is helping people to really just shift their mindset from seeing this as obligatory work. When we think about something as an obligation, certainly it can create sense of responsibility and accountability, but it also can create maybe a sense of burden, right? People don't want to be burdens.
Mm.
They want to be seen as high contributors, as valued individuals, as people who others desire to be in their presence and know what they have to offer and what they have to contribute. And I think that that is an important part of the reframe here of opportunity versus obligation. I felt it important to highlight that in the book, and I also wanted to amplify that in this conversation as well.
And one of the things you talk about is unconscious bias and disrupting it. If you don't mind, can you just, in a nutshell, because I get what unconscious bias is, but sometimes people may not, because once they see something that bias, they're like, oh no, I'm not that. But can you explain for folks what unconscious bias is?
Yes. And so, one first and foremost, Joe, I really like to, again, I love a good reframe. And so, in the book, I talk about how it is often referred to as unconscious bias or implicit bias. I like to put the positive spin on it and refer to it as conscious inclusion,
Mm.
because that is what I really want people to hone in on is what can I do to consciously make an intentional effort to be inclusive, right? And to create inclusive spaces. But let's go back to the question of what is unconscious bias? Well, the reality is that sometimes it's not unconscious, sometimes it's conscious bias, right?
Right.
So I think that's important to bring to the conversation. But if we think about it from an unconscious perspective, we are wired and conditioned to have lots of information that we have stored, right, into our psyche over time. And this is like since the beginning of time, everything we've been exposed to, there's a record that's being kept and stored whether or not we realize it. And anything could spur something on that record to then enter into our psyche, which enters into our mindset, into our decision making ability, into our interactions with others, our perceptions of others. And it doesn't make us bad people. It makes us human, but it also does not exonerate us from the consequences of our actions, which is why it's important to talk about leading inclusively and being conscious about disrupting bias when it can surface into our interactions and conversations, right? And it comes from all types of places. It could be from the media, it could be from different institutions and organizations we've been a part of, it could be from relationships we've experienced. And so, being aware of how to disrupt it, what it looks like when it shows forth, and most importantly, what to do when the bias has created harm for someone. How do we restore and repair that? And I deal with that in the book. I talk about it as bias is like a disease, and it is. If we don't try to address it, then it's going to continue to fester, and then it's going to grow, and then it's going to create even more harm. And so we have to be willing to acknowledge it and not just accept that this is part of who we are as human beings. Because, yes, it's part of us as humans, but it does not have to create the harm and the level of intensity in which it does, versus us being equipped with knowledge and resources and tools to understand how to combat it.
Dr. Nika, one of the things you do really well is nuance because not everything is so clear cut and dry. Can you talk to me about the importance of nuance in your work and in inclusion uncomplicated?
Yeah, well, this work is very nuanced. I mean, when we think about just, the breadth of cultural intelligence that is out there and that certainly can help us become more attuned to the difference that exists across humanity in general. It's huge. It's significant. I am one of those practitioners that I believe that one of my superpowers is living in holding the middle, right? The both and the nuances. I recognize that people are at different mental models, and I talk about these different mental models in the book. And so you have to really be discerning and be curious enough to ask questions about who is this audience? What is the makeup of these individuals? Where are they within their learning journey? Do we have a sense of that? And to make sure that you're listening for that. And I think it's important. Sometimes the reason that difference is classified as bad and divisive is because of how people classify it in their heads as good, bad, right, or wrong, instead of just difference. Diversity is simply a point of respect in which things differ, right? And so we have to become much more sophisticated in how in which we talk about and define diversity. It's not just about the optics of age, race, gender. It's so much broader than that. And so with that comes the necessity of being able to understand the nuances as you are instructing, facilitating, and leading people in discussions around this very broad, complex topic.
Hmm. And you sort of carry the marine ethos of leave no man behind, except leave no one
Mhm.
behind. How can we stop people from being left behind? And I know this is probably more of a broad strokes, more of it in generalities, but the fact that there's so many people that can be lost in the weeds in all this. Because there's so many different people there, age, gender, color, creed, whatever how do we avoid not leaving any of those people behind?
So there's a couple things I will say to that. I think the first is just centering on humanity. And if we center on humanity, I think that it allows us to open up the horizon of possibilities for how in which we can engage in creating a sense of inclusion and an opportunity for all. The other thing is that I am a believer that if we are able to address the needs of the most marginalized, so let's just think about all those groups, and they're plentiful, right?
Yeah.
Then we are going to be able to solve for a lot of the ills of the world. And so I really am big on making sure that people are showing up to these conversations, realizing the breadth and the reach of diversity, right? But at the same time, also being very thoughtful about who are the most marginalized. And if we can solve for it there, then I believe that we're going to be able to change the world. We're going to be able to bind us all in humanity. And so that's important. So we have to be able to be honest about, where the marginalizations exist and which communities and which populations. Sometimes we don't want to do that.
Hmm.
I think about the Black Lives Matter movement, where it was met with so much resistance from those who were saying, yeah, but all lives matter. And that's a whole different conversation.
Yes.
But
Oh my God. I'm so tired of having that conversation with people. I can't even imagine what you had to go through with that. But
yes,
yes.
no,
Yeah.
exactly. And so, and I think that for those of us who really care deeply about this work, we cannot do this work with good conviction and in good conscience if we aren't also concerned about justice. Justice is the outcome, it is the output, right? It is what we're seeking. And sometimes it's hard for people to connect justice to like the workplace. But when we think about really driving towards equity in the workplace, that is helping to really address the outcome of justice.
Mhm.
And it starts with organizations being willing to have a baseline of the data, to understand the data. Some organizations don't even want to get the data because they're afraid of the data. They're like,
Right.
well, we know what the data is going to tell us. And then I say, well, is it because you feel like you're going to be expected to overnight boil the ocean and to change things immediately? And then it's an opportunity to really dig deeper into really breaking down some of the anxieties that comes with that. And then I'm able to say, well, yeah, what you're after, what you should be after, is incremental change over time. But just standing still and refusing to even get the data is not the way.
Mm.
And so we can't be afraid of the data.
And I know having the right people in the mix is important for these organizations, but you and I know it all starts from the top. And you wrap up the book talking about inclusion is leadership. Can you sort of paint a picture for me, sketch out what an inclusive leader looks like to you?
I love this question. So, this is book number 3 for me, Joe, and my first book is entitled The Intentional Inclusionist. And I deal with characteristics and attributes of an inclusion minded leader. And when I use the term leader in that context, it's not by way of title or position, but it's by influence. And that's important because, again, as I mentioned early on in our conversation, people can lead from any place in the organization through their influence, right? And that's key because I don't want people to feel like they have to have a certain title or position in an organization to be able to move this work forward. And so inclusive leadership is really leaning into that, leveraging your influence to be able to create equitable spaces where people feel a sense of belonging and acceptance. It also means, being responsible for your own cultural intelligence. I like to use language like cultural intelligence and cultural humility instead of cultural competence because it's really impossible to be culturally competent on every culture. I mean, it's just, it's too much, it's massive, right?
Hmm.
But how can we build up our intelligence? How can we show forth inclusive behaviors through our allyship, right? How are we sponsoring and mentoring and making ways for others, right? How are we really building systems and policies and procedures that can help align with inclusive outcomes that we're seeking? Because that's critically important. I believe in driving towards impact and not activity. And so I talk about that in the book. Activity has a start and an end date. Impact is where you are looking at how do we get to the core, the crux of the matter, peel back all the layers and identify the root causes of issues that continue to create spaces where people feel oppressed and excluded and solve for it there so that we aren't just having this surface approach, right?
Mm.
And so, those are some of the ways in which, from a behavior perspective, inclusive leadership, I believe, can show forth.
I love that. It's so inspiring talking to you, Dr. Nika, and this is definitely an important book.
I have really enjoyed this time. I also want the audience to be aware that some of the special features of the book is that at the end of each chapter, I have an infographic that really just helps to summarize some of the most salient points. And we also have critical reflection And that critical reflection are different micro learning activities for people to engage in as they, attempt to try to apply what they've read in that chapter, so that they can be able to then not only model it and to teach others, but to live by it as well.
Yeah. By the way, I was going to mention I love the icon graphics that wrap up all of like the notes from each chapter, and you could cut it out, and you'll also have like a notes
Yes.
page in there. So it's a great book, but also you've laid out a playbook that folks
It's a
can,
tool.
yeah, they could
Yes.
just and like you mentioned, they pick and choose, dog ear, highlight, whatever it may be. But so this is your third book. How and why was it important to write this book to open up 2023 as opposed to the other two books? Why was now the time for this book?
The work has evolved. And as the work evolves, for me, it's important to get smarter and get more innovative in how in which we solve for the work. And so I've seen a lot, I've learned a lot. Since I've launched my consultancy 6 years ago, that experience with all the different types of clients that I've worked with and individual leaders, it has taught me a lot. And so I wanted to pull that knowledge into a resource that I felt was really timely. We're at a moment in history when institutions are collapsing, violence and injustices are skyrocketing, and the outcomes of systemic oppression go viral every single day. And I'm on the receiving end of that. I not only help organizations to navigate those complexities, but as a Black woman, I live those complexities, right? And I was really affected by how keenly aware I became of that. The stumbling block was that people saw this as too daunting and too complex to where they didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole,
Mm.
right? And so my thought was, how can I help people overcome that? And it was to simplify the work, simplify DEI, make it practical, so make it uncomplicated. And that was really the premise of the ground that I was standing on when I thought, yes, I want to write this book. And I was so fortunate to be able to do it with Forbes as my publisher. Forbes has an incredible brand, and I knew that the importance of my voice being centered in this book would be served well by aligning and partnering with such a well-known brand as Forbes. And so, really grateful for this journey. It's been a good experience for me.
That's excellent. You can pre-order the book now. It is out January 31st. It is Inclusion Uncomplicated. Her name is Dr. Nika White. Nika, let's not wait so long for our next conversation. So please stay in touch. Good luck with the book launch and enjoy the moment, okay?
I will. Thanks so much for this opportunity to share, Joe. It's good to reconnect with you today.
Absolutely. And that's it for this episode of the Forbes Books Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you take a second to subscribe so you automatically get new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I would love if you left us a review so more amazing entrepreneurs like yourself can discover the show. And please don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.